need quite a lot of wisdom to understand it. That was quite a difficult passage, and we're looking forward to Gareth explaining it.
Thanks, John. Should you always obey the government's laws? Should you always obey the government's laws? I reckon if we did a bit of a vote on that now, and don't worry, I'm not going to get you to, we'd probably have something of two camps. I guess some would say, yeah, always follow the law. And others might be going, well, actually, I'm not quite so sure. If we looked at our first passage, which was Romans 13, we'd get a one-sided view. One camp would be feeling quite smug and say, I've got the answer right. Just look down at some of the things there. Verse 1, let every person be subject to the law. We're given the reasons why. Because God has placed them in this position of authority. Or verse 3, do what is good and you'll receive the government's approval. Verse 4, the government is God's servant for your good. Verse 6, pay your taxes. There you go, it's clear cut, isn't it? But what happens when the government, for example, redefine marriage to make it more inclusive? What happens when government place restrictions on what churches should do under COVID? What happens when the government remove Bibles from schools because they forbid state-sponsored religion? Quote. What happens when government passes laws that girls over 13 can receive an abortion without their parents' consent or knowledge? What happens when governments legalize suicide? Perhaps it's not quite so simple as to simply say as a Christian, we just have to obey the law. While Romans 13 speaks positively about the government, other passages in the Bible speak less positively about government. For example, Psalm 2, we could have gone there, where we'd read that the rulers of the earth, the kings and the rulers of authorities and nations, they take their stand against God and his king, Jesus. And the psalmist goes on to say that they will face God in his anger. And in our passage where we'll spend our time today, in Revelation chapter 13, again, we're not going to get a positive view of government. For here, behind the vivid imagery, John speaks of the satanic corruption of government, leading to governments overstepping their mark. Actually, not only overstepping their mark, but persecuting God's people for not conforming to government agenda. And so actually, for the Christian, there are going to be times when we have to say, I'm not going to obey the government. Revelation 13 introduces us to two quite scary monsters or beasts. And I want you to think of them as puppets that are being controlled from above by the dragon, who we saw last week in chapter 12. And the dragon has been identified for us as none other than Satan, the devil, that ancient serpent who made his presence well known in the Garden of Eden and has done ever since. So these beasts, these monsters are his puppets on earth under his control. And together, the three of them are in opposition to God. And they're portrayed as counterfeit gods. When I was about 10, I can remember going on a family holiday to Southern Ireland. And I can remember being dragged up one particular hill. I think it was called Mount Eagle. I don't know if that even is a mountain. I don't even know if it exists anymore. But all I remember was being dragged up and admiring the views. Well, actually, the view was simply the mist and the rain and the cloud that was all encompassing. You know, you want your 360 panoramic on your camera. Well, There it is. It's grey. So the views weren't really going to entertain me and keep me happy on this walk up. So I turned to kind of looking down at the path. Maybe that could provide a bit more entertainment. And actually it did. Not that it was difficult, but on this path, there were various minerals. Now, I wasn't a budding geologist then, but it was a bit more entertaining and a bit more colourful than the grey of the mist. And the first thing that got my attention was this sort of white, shiny stone called quartz. I think it was my dad who told me it was quartz. I thought it was quite nice. And I thought, my watch says it's made of, the watch face, it says it's made of quartz. And I thought, well, it doesn't look much like that white stone down there. I carried on walking a bit more and keeping my eye down on the path. And I thought, oh, gold! I found gold! And all excited, went, Dad, look! I knew that even in those days, gold made you rich. I thought, my fortunes have changed in Ireland. And my dad looked at it, and I was a bit disappointed by his reaction, really. He wasn't particularly excited. I thought, Dad, I'm going to be rich. And he said, son, that's fool's gold. That's anpyrites, it's worthless. And it's like, oh, back to looking at the views. It was a counterfeit reality, wasn't it? It's a mineral in its own right, anpyrites, fool's gold, but it was a worthless imitation. It was a spin-off of something once good. Well, still is good, actually, if you've got gold. And that's really what these beasts are doing with the dragon. Again, notice that there's three of them. It's an unholy trinity. It's a parody. It's a parody of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But it's a distorted, ugly, hideous parody. It's an ugly reality. Let's look a bit more closely at the text to see this. Look at verse 4 of chapter 13 of Revelation. You see, we know that God has a right for our worship, and he has a right to demand our devotion. Well, look at chapter 13, verse 4. This is what the dragon wants. People worship the dragon because he'd given authority to the beast. Also there in verse 4, as the Father had given authority to his son Jesus to rule, well, so the dragon has given this first beast authority to rule. Or in verse 3, you'll notice that this beast had a mortal wound, but it's been healed. Can you see the echo, the parody of Jesus there, with his death on the cross before his resurrection? Or jump down to verse 12, where we come across this second beast. He's pointing people, he's shining a light onto that first beast. He's not craving or demanding worship himself, he's pointing people to the second beast. It's a parody of the Holy Spirit who shines that magnificent torch to magnify Jesus. So the dragon and the two beasts then form this counterfeit, hideous, unholy trinity, existing only to deceive the world into worshipping it and to destroy the church. Well, let's look more closely then at this first beast there in chapter 13, verses 1 to 8. It's a rather hideous image, isn't it? But again, with Revelation, we constantly need to remember that this is a vision and not the reality itself. And John hasn't just conjured up this imagery from his head. What imagery could I think of that could be really hideous? He's going back to the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. And Daniel in chapter 7 has a vision similar to John. And he has a vision of 4 beasts. And each beast that Daniel is told in the vision represents 4 succeeding empires, all of which will be world domineering and stand against God and his people. And you can look at those in your own time. And what you'll see is that John's vision in Revelation of this beast, it's like a composite. It's joining together those 4 beasts of Daniel into the one ultimate super beast, you might say, of here in John's beast here in Revelation. The 7 heads and the 10 diadems on the 10 horns symbolize the beast's oppressive universal power and his false claims to kingship. The blasphemous names represent the names that these Roman emperors from John's day wanted to be called by. So, for example, one emperor in John's day, Domitian, he demanded to be addressed as Dominus est Deus, which simply means Lord and God. So you've got this Roman ruler going around saying, it's okay, you call me Lord and God. It's utter blasphemy, isn't it? But don't think that the beast is limited to history, that it's simply the Roman Empire from John's day. Because look at verse 5, chapter 13, verse 5, and again, just note the kind of the time frame there. The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies and to exercise his authority for 42 months. And again, we know in Revelation that numbers are symbolic. It's not that we're looking around for some hideous ruler who's going to last for 3.5 years. We've seen from elsewhere in Revelation that 42 months, 3.5 years, 1,260 days, all the same time period, referring to this age between Jesus' first coming and his return. So what we're being told is that this beast is going to exist for as long as the church exists. Verse 3 shows us something of this beast's astonishing power. Did you pick up on the mortal wound that was healed? It was given a final death blow and yet still lived. Well, when we put that alongside the 42 months, we get a picture of evil. Evil rulers going to come, and they'll come and they'll live for a while, but then they'll die. But just when you think, oh, phew, we've got rid of that one, another one somewhere else in the world will turn up. And when that one goes, guess what? The next one comes hot on its heels. Initially, John is likely to be referring to Emperor Nero, who went around killing Christians, but then committed suicide in AD 68. But it was believed, according to legend, that he'd come alive again, which figuratively speaking he did, as the next Roman emperor who came after him just carried on with the same policies. Oh, there's a Christian, let's go and kill him. But again, it's all the way through history, isn't it? So we can go through different periods of history in different parts of the world, and we can see oppressive anti-Christian rulers trying to dominate the world. John Calvin, the reformer in his day, repeatedly claimed that the beast was none other than the Roman Catholic Church and the papacy. Today, it's Islamic State or North Korean Authority. But before we think, yeah, well, that's okay, that's somewhere else in the world, we've just got to be aware of complacency here in Britain. Liberal democracies where a nation votes for its governments are equally able to be corrupted by satanic influences. For such is the deceiving nature of the dragon and the allure of power, in the West we can create and even elect a beast-like ruler. During the political instability times between the First and the Second World War in Germany, that's exactly what the people did with Hitler and the Nazi Party. Hitler wasn't a communist dictator to start with. He was democratically elected. The Nazis were democratically elected. Even though they knew beforehand that Hitler was a political nobody, he'd even been imprisoned. Yet still, because of the instability in Germany and the depression that came after the First World War, they elected someone who said, we're going to conquer the world. You know, we're going to make Germany great again. So the beast is a power-hungry monster. And again, look at verse 7. It tells us that he's hell-bent on conquering, on destroying the church. As a student, sorry, not as a student, when I was working in student ministry in New Zealand the last few years, I got to know a lovely young guy called Gagi, and he was a Syrian refugee who'd escaped to New Zealand. And he was telling me of something of his story. He said, my family and I are Christians, and we could see what Islamic State were doing in the other parts of Syria, slowly not slowly at all, quite quickly taking over large swathes of land. And their tactics were quite simple. They'd knock on your door and say, bow the knee to Allah now or off with your head. Ruthless. And so he and his family fled to Lebanon to start with, and then eventually they got refugee status in New Zealand. It's the power of the first beast. Just 2 months ago, a group affiliated with Islamic State in Egypt released a video, and they showed the execution of a 62-year-old Christian, and his crimes in their eyes were simply helping to build a church and to help the government reduce terrorism in Egypt. But before we get too worried about the future and thinking that evil is rampant and that evil is going to win, be assured that God has placed his limits on evil. For repeatedly in Revelation, we've seen that the church, God's people, the followers of Jesus, are sealed. They are spiritually secure from the attacks of the beast. And again, look at 13 verse 8, because we can see it there. All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all those names who have not been written in the Lamb's book of life. Those who follow Jesus, Christians today all over the world, we are not under the influence of the beast. Evil will come, evil will surround us. We'll see its effects. We've seen that time and time again in Revelation, but we're not under its control. We're under the control of God. We belong to his kingdom. We are his people, and we are spiritually secure from whatever evil may bring towards us. And of course, if we know the end of the story of Revelation, we get to chapter 19, and we see that hell, a place of eternal torment, eternal punishment, is designed for the dragon and the beasts. So we're assured that all evil and all doers of evil will one day end up in the place that they deserve, under the right judgment of God. So how should the Christian respond then to such evil, to such anti-Christ authorities? Well, look at verse 9 and 10. Whoever has ears, let them hear. If anyone is to go into captivity they will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword they will be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people. Two quick applications here about what it means for you and I. Firstly, don't wage war for God. Don't wage war for God. We know that his kingdom will come, and it will come despite the persecution on the church. His church will grow because that's God's purposes. He is the ultimate authority over all evil, but it will come through suffering, not through war. The way of the cross, which was the way of Jesus, was the path marked with suffering. And that's the path for his followers too. The church will grow, God's kingdom will grow through peace, not war. Secondly, be realistic about authorities. Be realistic about authorities. We've seen from Romans 13 that we should honor our government. We should certainly pray for them, but don't ever trust them. Don't trust them that they will do right for God. Don't trust them that they will further the cause of God's kingdom or the cause of Jesus. Don't place your confidence in a political party, thinking that they will do the best job of helping Christians. Friday's news, and actually it's been going on over the weekend, showed us exactly why. You might think that members of parliament, cabinet ministers should lead by example and be of a high moral standard in order to help lead the country well. But how much concern was there for the health minister's affair on Friday? We were all concerned that he'd broken social distancing rules. And of course, the Labour Party want him sacked. And well, he resigned in the end, didn't he? But the concern was that he'd broken social distancing rules, that he'd got within 2 meters of someone else. Not the fact that he'd had an affair and sort of cheated on his wife and shipwrecked his marriage. Oh, that's not a concern. But breaking social distancing rules is. You think, what's going on in the world? That's why we shouldn't put our trust in political parties. Instead, put your hope in Jesus, and as verse 10 tells us, persevere. When we see evil around, when we see antichrist governments having their ways, that's not the time to give up on Jesus. That's the time to cling to him even more and to know that one day evil will finally be overthrown. So there's our first beast, anti-Christian authorities. Well, our second beast that comes is anti-Christian ideology. So we've got anti-Christian authorities now matched by anti-Christian ideologies. Let's go back to Revelation 13 and look at the description of this second beast. Look down at verse 12, because there we see the aim of this second beast is not to draw attention to itself, but to get the inhabitants of the earth to worship the first beast. In verse 11 and verse 13, we see the beast is described in terms of its appearance and then its actions. Like the first beast, he has horns, but these horns are like that of a lamb. So he's Christ-like in appearance, and yet when he speaks like the dragon. He speaks lies, he speaks deception, because that's his game. He acts in a religious way. If we look at verse 13, he shows us that he can even do miracles. As he replicates the great miracle of that God did in the Old Testament through Elijah, of turning the sacrifice to fire, when the chosen God of the nations at the time couldn't do it. So it's a religious-like figure. It's an enemy with a religious twist, pointing people to worship the first beast. His job is to make the worship of the first beast seem attractive, which is needed because when we think both in description and reality of what that first beast is like, he's not attractive. And so the job of the second beast is to put him in good light, to make him appear well so that people can be deceived into worshiping him. Maybe a way to think about it, maybe the way to think about this second beast is that of a kind of public relations officer. Again, let's go back to the Nazi Party in World War II. Take Joseph Goebbels. He was Hitler's spin merchant from 1933 to 1945. And in the years leading up to World War II, Goebbels would show people the economic miracles of Germany. Look at what we were like before Hitler came into power, he would say. And now look at our transport system, our autobahns. Look how magnificent they are. Look at what powerful leaders like Hitler do for you. Then there were the annual Nuremberg rallies, which grew in popularity, so that by the time we got to the start of World War I, over 500,000 Germans were attending them, with grand propaganda speeches, all portraying Hitler as the greatest leader ever. And as he continued, and as people began to be won over, and as the Nazi Party got more and more support, well, they could turn a blind eye to some of Hitler's less savory policies. In John's day, the empire wasn't Germany, but the equally brutal Rome. And the spin doctors, if you like, were forcing people to worship the emperor. There was a cult worship going on. And the enforcers of this cult worship were locals who expected that all should behave, and that those who decided to go against state religion, well, we'll just pass your name up the list and the chain of authority. And then suddenly you don't exist anymore. It's what happened here in Bedford in the 17th century, when the state church forbade the preaching of the gospel from anyone who wasn't an ordained Church of England minister. And so when non-conformists, people who didn't want to conform to that way of living, such as John Bunyan, comes along preaching the gospel, well, the religious authorities persuade the state that such a man should be imprisoned for 12 years. Today, again, this is the reality for masses in North Korea. Worship of any kind except state-sponsored religion is banned because of the state religion of self-reliance. This doctrine proclaims that human beings working together can achieve all their goals without supernatural assistance. And again, the enforcers are all locals, school teachers, checking that the children don't have extra religious books in their homes, or that mum and dad might not open a little red book at night that might cause social unrest to the nation. But not only does this beast ensure that state-sponsored religion occurs, he squeezes out into the public domain all nonconformists. Look at verse 16 and 17. This beast also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands or on their foreheads, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. It's a mocking irony of the sealing that's been placed upon God's people back in chapter 7. And here the beast places a counterfeit seal upon the rest of the world in order to kind of squeeze the Christians out, to bring them out in society, just so that they can be, just so that they can be not getting on in society, so that they can't function properly. In short, if you don't have this badge, you can't fit in society. Unless you conform to the current ideals of the culture, as a Christian, you simply can't function. I wonder if all this beastly activity seems a bit far from home. You know, Germany in the past, well, that's the past. You know, North Korea, Syria, a little closer, but it's not us. Well, certainly the overt persecution that's going on under the direction of the first beast isn't happening here. And we do need to be real and say that whatever light persecution might come our way at the minute, it's not on the same par as our brothers and sisters in communist countries, for example. But I think the spirit of the beast is looming above us, and maybe it won't be long before it's here. We live in a moral vacuum. The events of the cabinet have shown that in the last few days. We've got to accept, whether we like it or not, that our Christian heritage is now long gone. And we've been left with a godless ideology that the second beast is promoting, in which only a minority stand against. And as the pressure to conform comes on, as Christians are more and more squeezed, less and less Christians will actually take the stand and be seen as Jesus's followers. For example, the humanist society today are putting huge pressure on the government to abandon its law on collective worship in school. They claim that it's a breach of human rights to make non-religious and humanist children have to go through this ordeal. In schools and colleges here in the UK, we have equality and diversity agendas to make sure that there is tolerance of all minority groups promoted and all minority groups cared for, except the Christian minority, who are deemed intolerant because they hold to absolutes. Dan Walker, the BBC journalist who presented Football Focus and then The Breakfast Show for over a decade, was ridiculed a few years ago in the Telegraph newspaper when it was revealed he was a creationist. This is what the newspaper wrote: creationists cannot be trusted to report objectively or to interact reasonably with their interviewees and with the public. The irony was not lost, though, on those who made a stand in defense of Dan Walker. One person responded, "I thought that we live in a tolerant society where you can be a Christian, you can be a Muslim, you can be a Jew, and you can get on with life." Nor did any of the journalists even bother to ask what kind of creationist Dan Walker might be. They didn't seem to be aware that every Christian, Muslim, and Jew who actually believes in God is a creationist. I think this is the spirit of the second beast. It can also be seen today in the gender and sexuality agenda being propagated by many. And as their lobby groups gain greater and greater momentum, so the movement grows stronger and stronger. And it's now turning against those who are deemed intolerant because we hold to old-fashioned, outdated, offensive views. Yet again, we live in this age, don't we, where we have to conform to society or face being deemed, at best, irrelevant. Maybe we don't see this cosmic battle, but it is there, and it is going on under our very noses. This unholy trinity of the dragon and the two beasts are a reality today, even here in the UK to an extent. So John ends in verse 18 with a simple challenge for the church. He says, this calls for wisdom. We need to be aware of how these beasts, how Satan is operating in our society today, how he's at work in your schools, in your colleges, in your workplaces. We need to know that so that we don't fall prey to his propaganda and lies. We need to know we're going to be marginalized. And rather than complain against it, or rather than burying your head in the sand, hoping that it'll go away and one day our Christian heritage might return, we need to be active in challenging the culture. After all, counterfeits are eventually shown to be what they are, poor replicas. When Ali and my wife and I first visited Albania a number of years ago, we were full of excitement, visiting a new country. And from where we were staying to get to the church where we were doing some work, it was about a 10-minute walk through the marketplace, which was just fantastic. This hub of busyness. And I can remember through the crowd seeing this stall, and there were these T-shirts for sale, Adidas and Puma. And the currency is lek in Albania. But I could kind of work out even from a distance that there were these Adidas T-shirts for £1. I thought, yes, here's my wardrobe for the next year. And then as you kind of moved your way through the crowd and you got closer, you realized that they were slight counterfeits. Because while the logo that I saw at a distance was the same, the word was slightly different. Adidas was now Adibas. Puma, now Puna. And we chuckled. It's good, isn't it? For those who lived in the country with poor or no English at all, very easy for them to be duped into thinking they're getting a genuine shirt. But they're counterfeit, poor replicas. We've got to be careful that we're not taken in by these counterfeit gods. We need to see them, we need to call them out, and we need to stand against them. Yes, we'll be marginalized. Yes, you'll be deemed socially irrelevant. But if we're to be salt and light, if we're to have this preserving effect on society, as Jesus says his church must, then we have a Jesus gospel-centered responsibility. If you've been led in by these counterfeit gods, flee from them now while you can. Flee to Jesus, the one who looked slain and was slain. And if you're already a follower of Jesus, know that he died and rose again to take away your sin of being duped, of refusing to follow Jesus when the going gets tough. Remember that Jesus' death and resurrection wasn't just for your sin in the past, it's for your present sin and for your future sin. So when you go to work tomorrow and actually you kind of go, oh, I shouldn't have done that. When you start agreeing with the culture rather than standing against it where you need to and you've fallen. Remember then that Jesus' death and resurrection was to pay for that sin as well. Knowing and experiencing this forgiveness, knowing and experiencing his love day by day is the way that we will persevere and draw others to Christ as well. Let's pray. Lord God, it's a tough chapter to read because it speaks of our society in a way that we might not feel comfortable with. Lord, help us as your followers to know reality, to know that we have an enemy who is active, but to know that you are over him and that his end will come. Help us to keep close to you. Help us to know and to experience your love and your forgiveness day by day. Amen.
Let's have another song before